everyone to this fifth edition of Monday Morning Human Intelligence. So I'm really glad to have today Daniel Gomez. So he's a new friend. But it was the power of that story and the way that it changed my mind, the way that it inserted itself into my own thinking, that eventually was able to help me keep the aircraft safe and keep myself safe. There we go. So you need to have a character, and the character needs to be involved in some predicament. And the story includes some attempted extrication from that predicament. And this is from a great book called The Storytelling.
When I went through the course, we actually never had a chance to actually talk to people during the course until we got to the final exercise. And that was a massive 2-week-long excursion that was centered around a story called Pineland. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Pineland. It's where all the Robin Sage is held for special forces. And it's where the civil affairs and side guys go as well. So we used the story to set the stage for the students' deployment. And as they went and created their own story, moving through Pineland and interacting with people, they learned a lot of things about themselves, right? They had what we call experiential learning. They were able to make mistakes.
You're sharing that example, and I'd like to pull on two threads there, right? So I say that stories convey meaning, right? So lectures or memoranda or regulations convey facts, and you could stand in front of your students and tell them, here are the things that you need to do, but those are simply facts, and they go into a different place in our brain. But stories convey meaning. So what you did with those fits into our brain in a different way. And the second part is that stories create experiences. So just like you said, your soldiers are able to sort of visualize and inside their own minds prototype what would have happened if I had done this differently. Our brains are powerful enough to do that. So it allows us to see these different experiences not only in our own mind, but when you were telling me that story, I was seeing myself in a version of Pineland that I had created in my own brain, seeing myself
until they finish the exercise and they're like, man, talking to people is much harder than I thought it would be.
Right, humans are complicated, right? So it takes.
Yeah, we're weird. Yeah.
So the way that you communicated that story to your students and the way that you communicated it to us just now actually connects to another weird way that humans operate. So there were some researchers in 2010 at Princeton that put people into these functional MRI machines, magnetic resonance imaging, so they can see how the blood is flowing in their brains. Then they had one person spontaneously tell a story. So they told something that happened to them, and they recorded the blood activity inside their brain. And then later they put people inside these fMRIs to listen to that story. And when they compared the blood activity in the brain of the speaker with the blood activity in the brain of the listener, when you were telling a spontaneous story, you had this tremendous amount of overlap. So close that they called it cognitive coupling. So that when you were telling a spontaneous story and I tune into you, our brains are doing literally the same things inside their brains. And the more that you have that overlap, the better the communication is. And it only happens when you are essentially spontaneously telling a story. One of the researchers, Yuri Hassan, said that the story has to rise and burn in the living immediacy. It's not something that you can just recite, or it's not even as effective if you're reading it. It's something that is being formed and communicated in your own brain at that time. And you take these stories from your own experiences and your experiences with your kids, I presume. Is that correct?
100%. Yeah. It's a mix of our experiences with children that my wife has dealt with as well. But a lot of the stuff is that in those books have happened to us. Like it was my son's, and I can't not get emotional here, but when we moved from our house in North Carolina, he left his bubble wands on the doorstep so that the next kids can play with them, right?
Yeah.
So it's stuff like that we added in the book that really happened.
So I appreciate you sharing that with us, right? And that's really my fourth point about stories, is that conveying personal stories is like the supreme act of trust, right? That conveying personal stories where you talk about personal change is something that is very deeply embedded inside of us. So when we talk about collaboration, we talk about the importance of having psychological safety so that I can offer up my idea. and my idea is going to be respected. Those ideas are personal as well, but even more personal are those personal stories of change. Those things that were so deeply embedded in your own psyche and your own experience that whether it's your son or yourself, it took you from one path and moved on to another. Or even imagining the change that happens in the kid that shows up to the house that you PCS from, and they're having a bad day, and now they find the bubble wands that are there. And that's why sharing stories is often difficult for people. The very basics of how to tell a story. And Pixar, if you Google the Pixar Story Spine, that's a great place to start. They have some fantastic guidance for how to build whatever you're talking about into a story. But here's an even simpler way, right? So with your story, construct it around change. So first you say, before things changed, here's the way things were. Before this thing that I'm going to tell you about, this is what life was like. And then you talk about what is the thing that happened to cause that change. And then you say, because of that change, this happened, right? So for me, in the story I told about flying earlier, I'm talking about the day that I was flying around, and my vision started to get dim, and I started to be a little bit confused. And then this thing happened. That thing was, I remembered the story that I heard before. And because of that, I turned the oxygen to 100% and I survived. It's structured in a way that leads you to change. And there are, whether you're telling a story about bubble ones or about flying or about, I know I've used story in some of my personal experiences from being deployed and helping to process through those. This is a powerful way to communicate that. When you tell the story, there's a great TED Talk by Ted Lieber.
At any point in your life, you can say, this is not how my story ends. Yes. I love that quote. It's the difference is between a good storytelling, lets you imagine and create more moments, versus bad storytelling, which ends everything and there's no choice, nowhere to go.
Yes.